Hey everyone, it's Samuel,
And I'm Dave.
and welcome to Plot Hooks, the podcast where we explore the arts of narrative and collaborative storytelling in the world's premier RPG, Dungeons and Dragons.
Today, crafting authentic feeling history in our worlds.
In the wilds, the Rakshasa.
And in the tavern, what would you do if you were recognized by everyone in a village you've never been to before?
All right, let's go.
Let's do it.
Thanks for joining me again, Dave.
I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, it's been a little bit, about 11 episodes since you came and talked about your bard, and we're happy to have you talking a little bit about creating authentic history today.
I'm excited to be here and doing that with you.
Before we get into the prime material, just a couple of announcements to get out of the way. Remember to follow us on all of our social media. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, subscribe to us on YouTube if that would be your preferred way of listening to the podcast. And we also have to take this time to say thanks to all of our Plot Hooks family for helping us hit our goal of 250 followers on Twitter. We've been announcing since the very first episode about the giveaway of the free D&D 5th edition source book to a lucky follower. We've hit that now. So that contest is currently running as of the airing of this podcast. Should be done in a couple of days. So check out our aforementioned social media in order to enter. Finally, it'd be awesome of you to support us on Patreon. Lots of awesome perks are up there for all of our patrons. We just this past week released the creation myth for our homebrew world of Carrick. In addition to the things which are already up there, like the list of Carrick and magic items and the description of what sets Carrick apart from the other D&D settings, which we discussed a couple episodes ago in episode 12. Hopefully all this will just spark a few ideas for your dungeon masters out there. And your support is just really appreciated. It helps us make this podcast even better for you. All right, without further ado, creating authentic feeling history.
Yeah. So where do you want to start here?
Yeah, it's a rather broad topic, isn't it? But it's something that's important, especially for DMs that are homebrewing a setting. But really, even if you're playing in a pre-existing setting, such as the Forgotten Realms or Eberron or any of the standard Dungeons and Dragons settings that have already been released, you're going to be interacting with the past. Right at the very beginning of the Dungeon Master's Guide in Chapter 1, there's a list of core assumptions about the various D&D settings. The rules of D&D itself are based on the fact that these certain parameters are true. For example, one of them is that the world is magical. You can't have D&D in a setting where magic does not exist. The game just wouldn't work. Right. So many classes are based off of magic, and even ones that aren't, like rogues or fighters, have subclasses which give them some sort of arcane abilities. It's just so ingrained to the game that it's necessary to have that in whatever setting you're in. But one of those core assumptions is that the world is ancient. The world is ancient. The blurb actually states on page 9 of the Dungeon Master's Guide, it says, empires rise and fall, leaving few places that have not been touched by imperial grandeur or decay. War, time, and natural forces eventually claim the mortal world, leaving it rich with places of adventure and mystery. Ancient civilizations and their knowledge survive in legends, magic, items, and their ruins. Chaos and evil often follow, and empires collapse. D&D is built with these ancient civilizations in mind.
I think this is true of a lot of fantasy worlds, right? Like exploring ruins, figuring out what came before. That's like a central theme in a lot of fantasy exploration.
Yeah, absolutely. And no matter what setting your campaign is in, you're gonna at some point directly interact with something to do with the past, whether that be exploring a ruin or interacting with some artifact of lore or any number of different things. There's going to be something about the past of your setting which impacts what you're currently doing in your adventures. So the
Mhm.
question we want to tackle today is how can we make our ancient civilizations feel authentic, whether we're homebrewing ancient civilizations or just trying to make sure we handle different ancient societies in a way that feels authentic in pre-built settings like the Forgotten Realms. How do we make it feel real, feel legitimate as dungeon masters? Well, luckily, on the Plot Hooks team, we have Dave, who is an archaeologist. Tell us a little bit about what you do in your area of study.
Yeah, so I'm a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm the co-director of the Punta Laguna Archaeology Project, which is based in Punta Laguna, Mexico. I've worked on archaeological digs in Belize and Honduras, in addition to Mexico. So my background and experience is all in Mesoamerica, which is not necessarily the main source of inspiration for ancient civilizations in D&D. But hopefully I've got some knowledge I can share that'll help DMs craft better worlds.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure. So, as we go through today, we're going to be talking about making our ancient worlds feel authentic in two main sections. Because there are two main ways that we interact with the culture of the past generally. One is through the various ruins that we encounter, the remnants of ancient shrines, dungeons, buildings, and even whole cities that we come across in our
Mhm.
travels. And the second is through the study of the history and culture of those civilizations that built those structures themselves. So, first, we wanted to go through ruins. What's
Yeah.
one of the main things that we need to understand as far as ruins are concerned in a real world context?
Yeah. So one of the, I guess, let me say right at the top here that I'm going to be talking about the real world context, as you said, and a lot of these rules are flexible in a D&D context because you have magic that is
Hmm.
breaking the rules of the real world.
Yeah.
Um, and so that sort of goes without saying. It's a sort of addendum to anything that I'm saying here is that we can
Hmm.
bend these rules with magic. I would say that the first thing I'd want to point out, the first thing that I would be thinking about that a non-archaeologist might not be, is what we would call the taphonomic process, which is basically how things decay over time. And so there's a big bias in the archaeological record in terms of what is there for us to find, right? Perishable materials like wood or cloth fibers just don't last that long, right? Think about like if you drove out into the country and you saw like a abandoned farmhouse that had been left largely untouched for 50 years, right? It's probably unsafe to go in, right? And after
Hmm.
100 years, it's probably not likely to be much left at all, right? Those kinds of materials just don't last that long when they're exposed to the elements, right?
Hmm.
Something non-perishable like stone is likely to last a long time, but even that is going to get churned up, right? As it gets sort of overgrown with plants, you get roots growing in between the stones. A tree falls over and the roots rip the stones out of place, and you get this sort of churn over time. And so, really being aware of sort of what stuff is made out of and what's likely to be left and what's not is probably a good place to start.
Hmm. Yeah. Of course, this varies slightly based on the actual climate that you're talking about.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And so I would think about, maybe take some extreme examples are fun. So the Tarim Basin in Western China is a famous one. It's, one of the driest places on Earth, and things largely just don't decompose there. And so you have this sort of natural mummification process that happens. You have these unbelievable 4,000-year-old mummies that are that still have all of their soft tissue, like skin and hair, which you wouldn't get under normal circumstances.
Hmm. And that's something we can use to our advantage in different D&D settings as we're going into some more extreme climates. We can kind of use that to our advantage with a proper understanding of taphonomic processes. In
Mhm.
in general, this is obviously, this varies so much just based on, even I would imagine from, just 100 miles of each other can make a vast difference in this. But in
Mhm.
general, how long would we expect various types of structures to last? Like if we're in the middle of a campaign and we come across a structure that still has wood in it, how long before that's just absurd to say that wood still exists? How long,
Mhm.
before the stone carvings are so eroded that you can't read the writing any longer?
Yeah. So it varies a lot is the short answer. I can give you some
Mhm.
examples. So one of the things that's going to matter a lot for something like this is how exposed the thing is that you're concerned about.
Mm.
So in the area that I worked with the ancient Maya, there are some famous carved wood doorway lintels. So the lintel is the part of the door that is horizontal at the top of the door frame.
Mhm.
Um, and those some of these were carved in five, six, 700s, and so they're we're talking about over 1,000 years old, or like 1,300 years, something
Mm.
like that. And in some cases, because they are covered by a stone superstructure that is protecting those doorway lintels from the rain, they're still preserved. Those are also carved into very hard wood that decays slower over time, and so it depends a lot on how much it's exposed to rain and wind and the like.
Mm.
But even a stone inscription that is exposed to the rain is not going to hold up that long. But if something is
Mhm.
buried in the ground, if it's face down, right, those kinds of things will lead to much better preservation. In terms of how long buildings tend to stand, at the site where I'm working now, we've got it was occupied over a period of about 2,000 years, maybe a little bit less than that. Maybe we have several distinct occupations where people left and then other groups came back and reused the site. And so we have some structures there that were built in the 1400s, and a few of those are sort of like small stone shrines, and a few of those are still standing. Anything that was made earlier than that is just kind of looks like a mound of rock in the ground.
Mm. And with all of this, as we think about it as DMs, as we're crafting situations for our parties to encounter,
Mhm.
we can use this to our advantage in creating circumstances with incomplete information, because not all the information is going to be there. One of the pitfalls that we can fall into, I know I have in the past, is thinking that every civilization that is ancient, everything is still there. It just looks really old.
Mhm.
But in reality, there's going to be a lot of information, a lot of materials missing, and so you can create certain circumstances such as incomplete puzzles where perhaps
Yeah.
there's some wood elements amidst the stone that are missing, and you have to kind of puzzle it together, pun intended, or trap or door mechanisms which don't fully work properly because some of the
Yeah.
mechanics behind are actually decayed. And we
Yeah.
can kind of creatively use this to our advantage as we're generating encounters.
Yeah, absolutely. And because magic exists in the world, you also get to, if you want there to be a fully intact trap system, it can be a
Hmm.
magic one, right? But the reality is
Hmm.
that, like, the way it works in Indiana Jones, where he goes into the ancient temple and all of the and all of the booby traps are still work perfectly, right? That's just not going to happen in the real world.
You mean
Um,
those ancient wooden spike darts would have rotted over thousands of years?
Yeah, and I imagine any like poison on those spike darts would probably be a lot less effective now than it was 1,000 years ago.
That's true. Generally, how does the type of culture influence the way or the type of structures that are built? So if like we're coming across a society which, a DM wants to create that's very theocratic or centered around some sort of religious system, or one that is centered around a king, or a divine ruler, so to speak. Somebody who's ruling over the populace via divine right. Depending on how the culture is, will impact the structures that are built and how they're built. Correct?
Yeah, that's definitely true. And there's a lot to say here, but I think what I want to point out is that, and they say that limitations breed creativity. So I guess what I want to say is
Mm,
sort of point out some limitations maybe that can help you be creative in creating your
sure.
world. And so, one thing would be that, like, the availability of resources dictate a lot about what's feasible. Where I'm working in Mexico right now is part of the Yucatan Peninsula. The peninsula itself is a limestone shelf, and limestone is essentially the only stone resource that's available locally. Anything else would have had to have been imported. And so everything is made out of limestone. That's not ideal, right? If you're
Hmm.
putting in a new countertop in your kitchen, you could make it out of limestone. And I think they do make limestone countertops, but they're very porous, and so they stain easily, and maybe they're more fragile. And so that's a limitation that people living in this part of the world just had to deal with, and they had to figure
Hmm.
out how to make limestone work to build huge temples with.
Hmm.
People are creative, and they'll figure that out, but it's definitely a limitation. I would also think about what people in the society view as important. It takes a ton of coordination and effort to build a huge communal building, so it had to have been something that they really cared about.
So, like, for instance, if we're dealing with the instance of using a society based a lot around religion, perhaps that's a temple or a shrine of some sort. If we're dealing with some sort of Roman civilization where entertainment and the games were so important, you have things like the Colosseum, which are the primary things that we find, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely, right. And so, and we can take real life examples to inform those kinds of choices. And so ancient Rome would have been a good one where people prioritized athletic achievements, and so that's reflected in the kind of buildings they built. If we're thinking about a civilization that is particularly oriented towards devout religious beliefs, we might use ancient Egypt, where the pharaoh was
Mm.
viewed as literally a god incarnate. And
Hmm.
so, when you believe, if you believe that's true, right, that enables some really extreme acts of devotion, right,
Hmm.
to that leader, right. And the Great Pyramid of Giza is a great example of that, right. That was the tallest building in the world for something like 35 or 38 centuries, something like that, right.
Wow.
And so, if you believe that you're literally building this building for the god who lives over there near you, right? And this is going to be his tomb, right? That provides a lot of incentive to make it good.
Yeah, absolutely.
The other thing that I would like to point out is that it's easy to romanticize the past, but it's probably good to keep in mind that people living in the past were still people, and they had to do all of the things that we're still doing now, like eat and go to the bathroom, and then these sort of
Mm,
mundane actions that we
mhm,
tend to forget because we're thinking about the past as this, like, really dramatic, amazing place,
mhm.
right? We had a moment recently in our campaign in Carrick where we were exploring a ruin, and we ended up in the bathroom facility there, right. And that was wonderful for me, right. I really enjoyed that because it really makes this feel like it's a lived in place,
Mm,
right. Like, people actually spent a lot of time here, and
mhm.
they had to just take care of take care of business in the
Yeah.
same way that people in the modern world do, right. Right, these are not these are not concerns that people just didn't have in the past. They very much did.
Yep, absolutely. I think we also can romanticize it in the fact that all the things that non-professional archaeologists know about
Mhm.
are the massive structures, the amazing things like the Pyramid of Giza, like
Yeah.
the tiered pyramids down in Mesoamerica where you work, things like the Sphinx and all those Roman aqueducts and awesome things
Hmm.
that the ancient Roman civilization built. But those are outliers in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah.
I mean, most civilizations don't have the capability of building the Great Wall of China.
Sure.
It's, you know, unless you're talking about encountering in your world a major past civilization, you're not going to encounter necessarily a massive structure. And again, as you said, you know, I like that word. We romanticize it and we expect, oh, every ruin has this amazing structure. And I guess to a certain extent, those are much easier for us to find archaeologically
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
they're bigger and they stick out more,
Yep.
and they're much easier to locate. uh, we know much more about them because those civilizations are bigger and we have more record of them in other places.
hmm
But you know, I know one of the things that I used to find just in our area where I grew up in North Carolina, you know, we used to find just arrowheads all the
Yeah.
time.
Oh yeah.
My granddad had a farm down in a little place called Fuquay, and we would go down there every year just to, you know, he'd till up the land to
Yep.
plant some rows of green beans, and we'd go through and find a couple arrowheads every year that just got tilled out of the ground.
Yeah.
And there's not much remnant of that civilization left. That little village or whatever was there on that site,
Yeah.
but there's little things all over the place. It's not just always a massive structure.
Yeah. And there's so you mentioned some, you know, some of these large archaeological sites that are sort of impossible to ignore. And that's true. I mean, there's sort of a size threshold. There's a point at which it just is big and impressive, and you sort of can't not look at it and be impressed by it. But there's also these you know, structural issues that non-archaeologists might not be thinking about, like, you know, what is their funding for? And a lot of the stuff that we know about is the stuff that has sort of caught on in popular culture, and maybe
Mm,
there's more funding opportunities for people who are studying those, working in those areas. So the Maya area is a good example of that, maybe. So I've worked in, you know, what would be considered to be the Maya area for a while now. But before that, I worked in Honduras, which is just is sort of a non-Maya Mesoamerican civilization. And there
mm,
just tends to be less work that's done there. And it's not necessarily because the sites are smaller or less impressive. They're doing lots of cool stuff in in those areas, and they're building big sites there too. But there's this sort of attitude that the Maya are an important ancient civilization,
mm,
and these other civilizations maybe don't have that same sort of cultural cachet.
mm-hmm,
So there's that, and I think I would also point out that context matters a lot in terms of what civilizations are building, and how they're spending their time. And so in North America, right, we tend to think of North America as being as not having too many huge, amazing archaeological sites. That's really not the case. I mean, people, you know, like anyone who grew up around St. Louis has probably done like a dozen school trips to Cahokia, which is a huge archaeological site. It's largely earthen mounds, right? They were
mm,
building mound. So in the Maya area, they're building these huge temples out of stone. At Cahokia, they're building them out of dirt, and then they're building perishable buildings on top. And so if you go to visit Cahokia now, you get these enormous dirt mounds, but there's not that much else to look at in terms of architecture.
mm-hmm.
And so I think people maybe like their stone architecture better. And so, you know, an ancient Maya temple maybe looks cooler to people. It looks more like a ruin than something like Cahokia does. And so, you know, as a DM crafting a world, you might just want to think about what were the resources that went into building this? What was the
Yeah.
context? You know, what were people building out of and why? And given that, what would be left?
You mentioned a little bit earlier about how the site you currently work on was occupied for a very long time.
hmm
In general, if a city in question is built over, you know, several hundred or even a thousand years,
hmm
how easily are the older parts clearly identifiable?
It's pretty tough. Usually, archaeologists rely on sort of stylistic changes to know what is older and what is newer. You know, in the same way that you would be able to, like, you know, look at a picture of like a couple going to prom from like every decade of the 20th century and
Mm-hmm.
and organize them by age based on clothing and hairstyles and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Archaeologists are sort of trained to do that same thing for architectural styles and ceramics and things like that. So it's not necessarily obvious, but in some cases it can be. And if you're seeing things in different states of disrepair, maybe that's a pretty good clue too,
Mm.
right? You have one area where you have standing stone buildings and another area where you just don't, right? You
Mm.
have mounds,
Yeah.
buildings that are collapsed.
Do you ever encounter instances where there's a difference in material used across age within a singular civilization or within a singular site of a civilization? Or generally speaking, do since they're using the resources at hand, you normally just see, okay, if everything's built out of limestone, it's generally pretty much everything is built out of limestone, even if it was a little bit older?
So often with building materials, you won't see too much being imported, though there are plenty of exceptions to that, right? The Great Pyramid of Giza was built with, I think it's like granite and limestone, and a lot of it was quarried like 500 miles away or something. So there's
Hmm.
certainly examples of people moving raw materials long distances. One thing you might see, and I can give you a real life example from Honduras, is you see this sort of change from one of the main stone tools were obsidian blades. And obsidian is a kind of volcanic glass that's made under specific circumstances where
Mm.
volcanic rock is cooled very quickly. So if like lava like runs into an ocean or something like that. And obsidian is great because it flakes very, very sharp. And there's only a few obsidian sources located throughout Mesoamerica, and we can see in Honduras that people were using these sort of local obsidian sources early on, and then later on they switch to a foreign source that they're importing, and we can tell the difference because the foreign source is green, so it's easy to tell. We can also do an XRF analysis where we're actually like shooting lasers at the obsidian and
Hmm.
figuring out what the sort of chemical makeup is.
Hmm.
But even just by eyeballing it, you can say, oh, this is green obsidian. It must be from central Mexico. This is black obsidian. Probably local.
One of the big things about history of ruins oftentimes is that there's oftentimes battles that occur throughout
Mm,
history, especially within a fantasy setting. Like there's oftentimes in the history of the world some sort of apocalyptic event,
mhm.
that has occurred. Generally speaking, what kind of things would we find in an area which might indicate a past battleground at a particular site, whether that be at a particular site of like you could tell like a city was raised at one point in time, or
Mhm.
just like a particular battleground outside of a city? What kind of things might we see?
Yeah. So this is another area where I think you have lots of license to get creative. In the Maya area, we'd be unlikely to find any direct evidence of a battle. You might find destroyed monuments, right, where an invading force might have toppled a stone monument in the city they were invading. The thing we were most likely to find is a monument commemorating a successful battle
Mm,
against another power.
mm-hmm,
And there are some famous examples in ancient Maya history.
mm-hmm,
But Maya kings and queens loved commemorating that kind of stuff. Uh,
mm-hmm.
and so a lot of the inscriptions you find are things that are talking about this glorious battle that was waged against some other city in which they captured the ruler of the other city and then brought them back for sacrifice or something in their own city.
I know Assyrians in the ancient Near East love to do that too.
Oh yeah,
There's lots of really gruesome stories about the different things that they reported that they did to the various people that they encountered
yeah.
in all of their relief carvings.
Absolutely. And for a long time, we didn't actually think that was true in the Maya area. Before we could read the inscriptions, there was this mistaken idea that the ancient Maya were this peaceful civilization of astrologer scribes who worshiped the passage of time and were nonviolent. And then as soon as we started translating any of the monuments, we realized, oh no, they were really actually quite violent.
I feel like that should just be the assumption of a human civilization, as bad as that is,
I
until
know.
proven otherwise.
Yeah, yeah, it is. It is sort of a theme in world history. Yeah. In terms of actual battlegrounds, even in the most extreme circumstances, right? So if you're thinking about like Verdun, the World War One battlefield, that it's largely been reclaimed by plant life. You can still tell it was a battlefield, right? You still have this
Hmm.
sort of, it has this sort of like unnatural undulations in the ground. Uh,
Hmm.
from where it was, from where all of these bombs were detonated and where trenches were dug and stuff like that.
Hmm.
Um, but it's probably not too long before something like that is very, very hard to
Hmm.
distinguish, right? You've
Yeah.
got rainfall, you've got erosion, you've got plants growing and churning up the ground, the actual remnants of a battlefield. And you can probably see this, if you go around the United States and you visit like, Revolutionary War or Civil War
Hmm.
battlefields, they don't look like much.
No.
There's not a
Yeah,
ton to
I
see
know.
there.
I've been to Gettysburg and a few Civil War battlefields, and they just kind of just look like hills, and you're like, yeah, they stood up on this ridge,
Yeah,
and
right.
and you're just like, okay.
Yeah, right, right. And so if you're actually like looking for evidence of a battle there, it's mostly going to be in the kind of artifacts you might find, right? Bullet casings or something like that.
Hmm.
And so I'm not sure what that signature would be in a D&D setting. Maybe there's remnants of magic or something like that, but you might find artifacts too.
Secondly, not only do we have the ruins themselves that we interact with, but we also just interact with the history of the civilizations themselves. There's lots of different things which make up a society that that we might discover from ruins or from ancient texts or otherwise. Things like politics and religion and art and trade and the like.
Mhm.
As of course, magic and the arcane in a Dungeons and Dragons setting. What things might we see or find that might give us some indication of what a civilization was like in different regards?
Yeah, so I think maybe my main goal here would be to think about what the material signature of the cultural characteristics would be, and then try and put some clues based on those. And this is sort of what archaeologists are fundamentally trying to deconstruct, right? Is that we get
Hmm.
material culture that is in some cases preserved and in some cases not, and we're trying to reconstruct ancient lifestyles based on the stuff that we find, right? And the stuff we find is generally garbage, right? Occasionally it's not. Occasionally it's things that are buried intentionally or ceremonial in some way, but most of what we find is just garbage. And so if you're constructing an ancient civilization that has some particular religious characteristic or has some specific trade network that you want to highlight, think about what stuff would be left as a result of that. Let's say they're part of a trade network where they're, exporting some sort of crystals, right, somewhere else, right? So they have this natural resource they're exploiting and they're exporting it to other parts of the
Hmm.
world, right? Well, what are you likely to find there? You're going to find the crystals? Well, maybe some, but most of those got exported elsewhere. So what are you likely to find? Well, the byproducts of processing these crystals, right? Maybe they have to be like, you know, sort of like flint napped out of a rock or something, and you get this
Hmm.
like stone refuse that's left there, right? It's not the good stuff, it's the extra, it's the garbage, right? And so if you have some sort of crystal processing facility, right, that's what you're going to find there, right? Maybe some tools and whatever garbage is left over from that process, right? If they're making metal weapons, you don't just find this like fine mithril battle axe sitting there, right? Somebody would have taken that, right? People don't leave their best stuff lying around when they leave. They leave the garbage lying around. So maybe you have like, slag. I don't know what the mithril processing like the facility looks
great,
like.
Man. It doesn't leave slag.
Yeah, right. Yeah, but you might want to think about like, what does that facility look like? What are the byproducts of doing it? What is going to be left over? And maybe that's the kind of clues that you can have your players have to sort of puzzle out.
As you were talking, the thing that made me think of most was the mercury poisoning of the soil in several areas of South America, where they were using during colonization, they were using mercury amalgamation to recover silver. And there's areas where just the ground is just toxic, from the amounts of mercury which is just there from the waste product of all of the processing of that particular ore. You don't find much of the silver, I would imagine. As you're looking at those sites, you just find a bunch of mercury poisoning.
Yes, right, exactly, right. That's a great example of that. There are examples of people who use cinnabar as pigment, right, to make this sort of the sort of red color in pigment and paint and stuff. And that degrades into mercury over time as well.
Interesting.
So this is something that is a concern if you're working in like Central American tombs or something, and they would have painted stuff red, and now you've just got a bunch of mercury sitting around in those tombs.
That's really interesting. I did not know about that. That's really cool.
Yeah.
Generally, in your experience, how long does it take a sophisticated civilization to develop? Like whenever you're looking at a particular archaeological site, how long are we talking for a civilization to go from a village to something that we're actually going to find in modern times?
Yeah, so there's no one path, right? There's no guarantee that any group of people will sort of build on previous generations in the same way that some other group does. Right. And this is sort of a common misconception about the way that civilizations develop. And you can see this in like Star Trek episodes and stuff, right? They go to some other planet that has a pre-warp civilization, and they look at these people and they say, oh, wow, studying these people tells us about our own past, right? No, it doesn't. Not at all. Right? Like these people live on a different planet from you. It doesn't tell you anything about your past, right? They have their own trajectory and they're not going to follow the same path as you. And so I think we're sort of, like, and maybe like, maybe the video game Civilization sort of like gives this impression too, that like, every civilization follows the same path and hits the same sort of major technologies along the way in the same general order. And that's not really true either. So I guess it's a hard question to answer because there just is no answer. It could happen quickly, right? I mean, something like the Aztec Empire is a good example of that, where you go from this sort of nomadic, at least in the sort of Aztec origin story, it's not exactly clear how true this is, but you go from this sort of nomadic band of people to massive civilization with the, based in the largest city in the world in a couple hundred years. So it could happen fast, or it could just not happen, right? There's no guarantee that people ever really settle down into cities, right? There are still modern day hunter-gatherer people. So there's no one path, and there's no sort of essential timeline or steps that civilizations have to take to get from point A to point B, right? Every group of people kind of builds on previous generations and then takes their own sort of unique path into the future. And I would encourage DMs to sort of get weird with it, right? I mean, like, especially for like coming from someone who works in the pre-Columbian Americas, there's a lot of stuff that people tend to take for granted that people didn't have in Mesoamerica before Spanish contact, like beasts of burden, right? So this is something that we just sort of take for granted as it having existed for a long time, right? There were no horses or oxen or even llamas or anything. I mean, they had those in South America, but not Central America. So that puts some really significant constraints on the kind of things that you can do, and a lot of the sort of manual labor that would have been outsourced to a domesticated species in another part of the world had to be done by humans in Central America. And so, yeah, you have these sort of like, accidents of invention or just accidents of what you have available to you that really can radically alter trajectory of a civilization.
The ultimate truth as we talk about all these things is there's supposed to be some sort of ambiguity to it. We're not supposed to be able to examine a structure before your long rest and understand everything about the culture. There's supposed to be some ambiguity there. We don't want to give a ton of answers.
Yeah, right. I think, and that's it's just fundamental truth of archaeology as a discipline, is that we are never going to know everything about the ancient civilizations that left us with the stuff that we're studying. And I think that idea is kind of built in to D&D as well, right? If you cast legend lore on something, you don't just get the full story, right? You get some sort of riddle, some sort of puzzle to solve, some kind of incomplete picture of what this object was. And so, yeah, I mean, I think part of what's fun about studying an ancient civilization or exploring a ruin or something is the mystery of it. And I think you probably don't want to spoil that too much.
Yeah, absolutely. It's also true, I know when we were talking about this, preparing for this episode, that we also interpret a lot of things that we find through the lens of the world we live.
Yeah.
That through our modern lens, we look back at these ancient artifacts in ancient cultures, and sometimes we can interpret things wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes we just have to throw up our hands and say, who knows? Right. It's a common joke among archaeologists that when you find something that is perplexing to you, you just say, oh, it must have had some kind of ritual significance, because we frankly just don't know. Right. I mean, maybe this had some sort of, clearly had some sort of function to people. They made it. Right. They used it. Right. They were, in a lot of cases, they were making a lot of them. And we just sort of don't know.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so if we find something like a ceramic figurine, right, well, we kind of, as archaeologists, we have to create some kind of analogy to figure out what this could be. And what kind of figurines do we have in the modern world? Right. Well, sure, we have some that are used in rituals. We also have ones that are children's toys. Right. So could these have been children's toys? Yeah. Right. We really don't know. Right. We don't know how these things were used. We just have the objects, and then we're trying to interpret them, and we are obligated to do so through our own sort of cultural lens. Yeah. And I think that maybe that is also an area that a DM could play with. Right. I was thinking about that in the context of Carrick, where we have this sort of long-term stable peace in at the time in which we are playing our campaign. That wasn't true in the past, right? There was large-scale warfare happening in Carrick in the past. Would our characters even know what a military fortification looked, right? That's not obvious to me, right? They're coming at this with this completely different worldview that maybe doesn't prepare them to understand what it is they're finding at a ruin.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something to think about as you're letting your players roll history checks. That there's, it doesn't matter how many natural 20s are rolled. If you have not interacted with a siege weapon for 200 years, then you might not know what a siege weapon is. If you've never encountered that in your culture.
Yeah.
But I think that will just about do it for the prime material today. What do you say we head over to the wilds?
Yeah, I'm ready.
All right, well, we're out here in the wilderness.
Okay.
Today, the Rakshasa. This creature was voted on by our fans on Twitter. It originates from Hindu folklore and was also adopted a little bit into Buddhist folklore, but primarily Hindu in the Indian area of Asia. According to real world legend, the Rakshasa is a demonic entity that was exiled from the realm of the gods and forced to dwell on Earth. And they had very powerful magic and shape shifting abilities and were very well known for their love of human flesh. Very friendly. And D&D Rakshasas definitely take cues from legend, but they do add their own flair. The D&D version is definitely a fiend, an eater of people, an arcane caster, a shapeshifter. But there's a few different things which give it some flair. One is that they're tiger humanoids. You know, if you look at their picture in the monster manual on page 257, they just look like a humanoid tiger. Rakshasas in Hindu lore were mostly just fiendish and grotesque looking humanoids. They also haven't been strictly tigers across D&D's edition. In second edition, they could also have the head of an ape.
Interesting.
I've seen speculation in my research that it's possible that this choice to make them tigers combines a lot with Indian were-tiger lore, where tigers in Indian legend, by my understanding, are sorcerers. And the were-tiger lore combined with the Rakshasa lore creates more so of what we would actually be looking at in terms of a visual representation of the D&D Rakshasa.
Interesting.
They're also, secondly, vulnerable to piercing from magic weapons wielded by good creatures. A very strange vulnerability, awkwardly worded. Piercing from magic weapons wielded by good creatures is literally what it says. But
yeah, it's a lot of boxes to check.
Yes, exactly. What this actually comes from is the 1970s show Kolchak the Night Stalker, believe it or not, which
have you seen an episode of this show? I've
never seen an episode of this show. But apparently Gary Gygax, the creator of Dungeons and Dragons, was a big fan of it, and that show had an episode where there was a Rakshasa in it, and which was a shapeshifter, just like the typical lore. But in that particular episode, it had a vulnerability to blessed piercing weapons or crossbow bolts. So actually in first edition, a crossbow bolt blessed by a cleric instantly killed a Rakshasa. It just had this vampire wooden stake in the heart type of vulnerability, which Gygax said that he just enjoyed with a fiend, and so that made it into the monster manual in first and second edition. We didn't see it again in the rest of the editions until we came around to fifth edition, where we have this kind of streamlined version where it's not so narrow that it never comes up. It doesn't have to specifically be a crossbow bolt or specifically blessed. It just has to be wielded by a good creature, and it has to do piercing damage. And so it's we just have evolved into this kind of odd vulnerability, which is kind of interesting, and you can use it to tell some interesting stories with.
Yeah, how would you go about incorporating something like that into storytelling?
It's a really interesting question. You can use it just by dropping it in the middle of a combat encounter where you are actually unaware of what the creature's vulnerabilities are. And all of a sudden, your good aligned cleric hits this creature, and it takes much more damage than you would expect. A damage vulnerability in Dungeons and Dragons means that it essentially takes double damage of whatever damage you would actually typically do. And so you can just kind of spring this on them in the middle of the encounter, because they have immunities to magic and immunities to non-magical attacks that deal bludgeoning, slashing, and piercing damage. And you can have almost this little bit of a puzzle as far as which weapons are effective, and just solely use this as a combat twist, so to speak.
Yeah.
But I imagine creative DMs could actually come up with a interesting way of actually introducing this to a narrative where they're perhaps interacting with a Rakshasa or even a creature, since this is a shapeshifter, which they are unaware is a
Mhm.
Rakshasa. And this Rakshasa refuses to interact with certain members of the party because of their alignment, just refuses to interact with the cleric or refuses to interact with the paladin, but chooses to only interact with the kind of sketchy rogue with a criminal past,
Mhm.
and only uses that as his contact with the party. And they're kind of just sitting there wondering why that is, until they finally uncover that this is a Rakshasa entity that is actually vulnerable to damage that this entity would otherwise normally deal. It's a fascinating little tidbit. I'm sure there's any number of ways you can use to just kind of introduce it and use it in different
Yeah.
ways. They also have just the quirk that their hands are backwards. Their
Okay.
palms are where the back of their hands would be. So not just turning your hands face up and saying that that's normal, actually looking at your hands with your palms down, and now all of a sudden put the palm on the front of your hand and imagine your fingers bending towards you. So your thumb is still pointed towards your body, but it is curling up towards the top of your hand. And it's really weird to
It's
imagine,
weird.
but that
Yeah.
is a quirk that appeared in second edition, that is a really identifiable trait whenever they're in their true form, of that tiger humanoid. I have no idea of where this came from, could not find
Yeah.
anything,
Huh.
but it's there. And
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and
and
I know because we also checked like the various Magic the Gathering Rakshasa cards to see if
yes.
they had this trait too, and they don't. So
Yes.
this seems to be D&D specific
Yep.
Rakshasa lore that their palms are on the back of their hand.
Yeah, that's very strange, but again, something you could use if you're chasing an entity that you don't know what it is, and you roll a perception check as it ducks into a dark alley. You can see this trait.
Yeah.
That's something a DM could drop. And then, you're making history or religion checks, or whichever your group tends to prefer when dealing with fiendish entities, to know if you know about it. And you can actually identify a creature by this factor that they
Hmm.
have. The last kind of difference they have from traditional Rakshasa lore is just that they're extremely resistant to magic.
Okay.
They're very powerful entities in legend, but I don't know of any, real life lore which necessarily makes them resistant to magic, although my knowledge in that is limited. But across editions, they've been unaffected by lower level spells. And in fifth edition, they can't be affected by spells of sixth level or lower unless they want to be. So you
Huh.
solely have to use physical attacks against them unless you're doing something that's seventh level or higher.
So I imagine that the difficulty rating would change really dramatically depending on who you are, who's in your party.
Yes, absolutely. That's definitely one of the key factors to using this as a DM. They are a challenge rating of 13, but it does vary so much. If you have
Yeah.
a party of just barbarians that are just going to, rage and wail on this creature,
Hmm.
then it's really not necessarily that powerful. But if you have a bunch of magic users,
Yeah.
especially if you have magical users that don't have a melee option, and your
Yeah.
party hasn't reached the level of having seventh level spells yet, I mean, you almost can't even throw this at your party,
Yeah.
because they just have no way of interacting with it at all.
Yeah. You give the bard some incentive to take out their dagger.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Everybody's going to be looking through their inventory to see what random weapon they picked off of a goblin 40 sessions ago when they were level 3.
Yeah.
Um, but that variance is part of what makes them really interesting to tell stories with,
Yeah.
because there's so many different quirks that you can use. And that's why we highlight specific monsters on this show is because they have those little quirks. But the Rakshasa especially is
Yeah.
just really sweet to use. And you can use them in a variety of different ways. They make great horror monsters because they eat people. That is kind of tucked away in the lore of the monster manual. It's just kind of just stated that they like humanoid flesh, but they do.
Mhm.
They make great recursive threats because, like all fiends, if they are killed in the prime material plane, they just go back and reform in the nine hells, in the Rakshasa's case specifically. And they actually have to undergo this terrifying and agonizing process of returning to life that takes several months as its body reforms. And it remembers exactly who killed it, and it is extremely vindictive. So you
Mm.
actually have a recurring threat. And you actually saw this in Critical Role Campaign 1. There was the Rakshasa Hodis, which they actually killed twice in the prime material plane before they traveled to the Nine Hells to actually squash it for good.
Yeah,
Uh,
interesting.
they're great mystery monsters because they keep their presence so well hidden and disguised. The party can be investigating murders in a town, unaware that it's actually a Rakshasa that's actually this cannibal that they're trying to hunt down. They are very much a classic lawful evil creature and are from the Nine Hells. So I wonder if there could be some sort of situation where you can force a deal on a Rakshasa. Devils love their contracts. And I'd love to see someone in a campaign forcing a Rakshasa to do their bidding because they are so versatile and so interesting. And you actually have this Rakshasa as an NPC, and that can be very interesting as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, very interesting creatures that can be used in a wide variety of ways, but a little terrifying. So I think we'll probably head on back to the tavern and hope the tavern keeper is not a disguised Rakshasa.
I think that's best, yes.
All right, let's go. Back in the friendly confines of the tavern, safe and sound, supposedly.
I hope so.
Yeah. What's the plot hook that we're going to be looking at today?
So today's plot hook was suggested by Patreon user Salkin. Thank you for that suggestion. And it is, what would you do if you were recognized by everyone in a village you've never been to before?
I love this plot hook, and I am sad we are talking about this on the show because I want to use it in my. But this particular plot hook, it seems to be that there's a number of different ways you could use this that would be fascinating. It would be an awesome vision sequence, where your deity, whether it be the forces of nature, if you're a druid or a ranger, or someone like a paladin or cleric serving a particular deity, they could be using it to try to show you something about a future, indicating that the party was supposed to interact with this town and get some sort of renown in it in the future. Perhaps they're going to save it sometime in the future, or it's some sort of harbinger of things to come. Or it could be a vision that the party was going to have some sort of negative impact, or perhaps they already have had some sort of impact. Maybe a
Yeah.
choice made earlier in the campaign had unknown repercussions that negatively impacted this town, even though they never went to this town. Maybe they chose to save another town instead of this one, and now this vision is revealing that these people know exactly who your group of adventurers is, and
Yeah.
they hate your guts, or they love you for some sort of decision you made which positively impacted you. So it would be a great vision sequence. But apart
Yeah.
from a vision sequence, how can we use this in real life? How could we use this where a party is just walking down a road and comes across, whether it be a village or a town, some sort of bigger thing, or come across a smaller group, perhaps a caravan on the road, or just a roadside tavern or something, and all of a sudden the party is just recognized by everybody.
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways you could play this, and potentially all of them are interesting, right? You
Mhm,
could have it so that, as you were mentioning before, that there's something that this person or the party has done previously in the campaign that has gotten back to this town and was meaningful to them in some way.
mhm.
But I also like this as just kind of like a Twilight Zone-y kind of mystery setup where
Yeah.
people clearly seem to have met you before, or at least think they
Mhm,
have. And there's a couple different ways that that could play out, right? That someone has been impersonating you. Perhaps it was a Rakshasa who came to town
mhm. Yeah,
masquerading as
absolutely.
you,
Yeah.
and you have to sort of uncover that mystery. I don't know if there's, some way that you could have actually been there before, but you don't remember it for some reason.
Mhm.
Someone's cast
Yeah.
some sort of spell on you that has,
Mhm.
blocked this out of your memory.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so I think there's a lot of different sort of interesting, creepy ways you could take this.
Mhm. Yeah, I was thinking of creatures you could actually use in this regard, and the Rakshasa is one as far as, the impersonation aspect.
Mhm.
Another one is doppelgangers who
Yeah.
could have passed through this town impersonating you. I also like the idea of you coming across. It wouldn't really work for a town because it has to be slightly smaller scale. But if you're talking about a roadside inn or
Mhm.
something like that, and you come across a place which is essentially run by doppelgangers. The entire, even the patrons are just masqueraded doppelgangers, and they all act like they know you, and it's just an act at first, but doppelgangers have the interesting ability to actually be able to read your surface thoughts, and perhaps after they maybe worm some information, they can even maybe have one of the patrons that's secretly a doppelganger shapeshift into maybe someone that or just work up some sort of scenario where they're actually going to try to either harm your party or just trick and steal from your party. And you can really do this with any creature which you can homebrew or otherwise, which has the ability to read minds.
Yeah.
But I think that would be a really interesting, again, Twilight Zoney type encounter where you just come across this place and everybody knows who you are, and they all of a sudden are trying to trick you into giving them some of your items or trying
Yeah.
to get some of your gold or what have you.
Yeah,
um,
because I think different players or different characters would react to this in really radically different ways,
yes,
right? I
absolutely.
think some would probably be threatened by it and might be tempted to
Mhm,
react violently, and others might be tempted to kind of go along with it and see
mhm.
and see how deep the rabbit hole goes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, and so I think that this opens up a lot of cool opportunities for DMs as storytellers, and then also for players as as people trying to figure out like what the heck is going on in this weird
Yeah,
situation.
absolutely. And it also has the benefit of being one of those plot hooks, which is useful as both a one-off session-long encounter
Hmm.
where this is discovered and the mystery is found out, to something which can be a lead in to a longer campaign arc where, oh, all of a sudden these people have been impersonating us across the realms,
Yeah.
and now the hunt is on, and you
Right.
have this whole plot line now that piggybacks off of the discovery of this mystery, where now you have to find out where these people are and track them
Yeah.
down, and it just creates a whole arc of
Yeah,
your
and yeah,
particular
yeah, and
story.
maybe you have to clear your name, right? Maybe
Yeah, that's
you've done
true.
something
Yeah.
that you know, that that have made you famous in a bad way for some sort
Yeah.
of crime they've committed or something. Maybe they're impersonating you and like robbing people.
Yeah.
Who knows? And then you
Yeah.
have to clear your name and bring them to justice. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can see that very well, especially if you're a higher level party where you're widely known already.
Yeah.
You can have almost the protection racket,
Hmm.
of people coming through, in cities and criminal organizations, extorting shop owners for quote unquote protection, and you can have this group coming through this particular city masquerading as widely known as these adventurers and protectors and these powerful people extorting the town for quote unquote protection, and
Yeah.
making off with huge sums of gold,
Yeah.
because you wouldn't want anything bad to happen to your city,
Absolutely. Yeah. This really is a wonderful plot hook because
Yeah.
there's so many different directions you could take this, all of which are
Yes,
really interesting.
absolutely. Well, I think that just about wraps up this week's episode of Plot Hooks.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Dave, for joining me.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
Happy to have you on as always, and we appreciate all you out there for listening. And thanks for all of us here at Plot Hooks, me, Samuel, Dave, Matt, Mike, Steve, Zach, Becca, and of course, podcast Pupper Ellie. We'll see you all again next week for another episode of Plot Hooks.